Alright, this video is going to be over Chapter 4, Section 1 in your textbook. Remember that you can access all of this stuff on the Pearson website. But we're going to talk about congruent figures today. And in class tomorrow, I'm going to have a question for you. And it's not going to be answering a question from this video. The question this time is actually going to be over something that was from this video. So make sure you take good notes and make sure you bring those notes to class, so that way you can answer those questions. Each class period is going to have a different question, so make sure you are prepared for that. You only have one vocabulary term that you need to make sure you know for this lesson, and that is congruent polygons. Congruent polygons are going to have congruent corresponding sides and angles. Corresponding means that they are in the same position. So for example, A and E are corresponding, B and F are corresponding, C and G are corresponding, and D, that should be a D, D and H are corresponding. And so, let me see if I can, nope, I can't fix that. That's okay. Alright, so D and H are corresponding. You can also talk about the side lengths or the sides of the figure. So AB is corresponding to FE. And they also are congruent to each other. So that's important that you understand that as well. They have the exact same length. Corresponding means that they're in the same position, but if these two figures are congruent, which we said they were right there, then that means that these two, the side lengths that are corresponding, are going to be congruent to each other. So AB and EF, BC and FG, CD and GH, and then DA and HE. Also, I had said earlier all the angles. So angle A is congruent to angle E, angle B is congruent to angle F, angle D, I'm not going in order, angle H, and angle C is congruent to angle G. So if I know that angle A is, say, 95 degrees, then I know that angle E is 95 degrees. So you need to make sure that you are familiar with this, that this is something that you can do. We're going to do some examples in a second, but next I'm going to show you a theorem that you need to know. Alright, so the theorem that you need to make sure you know is pretty self-explanatory, but it's something that you'd be surprised on when you actually have to use it. It's called the third angles theorem. And it says if two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then the third angles are congruent. So in this picture I have triangle ABC and triangle DEF, and I have A and D marked as congruent, and then I have B and E marked as congruent. Basically what this theorem says is that if A is congruent to D and B is congruent to E, then we can conclude that angle C is going to be congruent to angle F. You'll need to make sure you remember that. That's a theorem that you just need to have memorized because you'll need to use it for other problems in the future. Now we're going to do some example problems. So I'm going to go ahead and change to a new page. Alright, so here's one of those questions where they're going to say, okay, if ABCD is congruent to EHGF, what are the congruent corresponding parts? Well, when you look at the picture, it's kind of hard to tell what goes with what. I mean, this one I think is easier than others can be, but what's helpful here is what's listed in the instructions right here. Notice how there's an order. A is first in the first one, and E is first in the second one, so that actually tells us right then and there that angle A is congruent to angle E. Oops. Let's try that again. B goes with H. C goes with G. And D goes with F. We can also use that same logic or that same reasoning or pattern with the side lengths. AB is congruent to EH. BC is congruent to HG. CD is congruent to GF, and DA is congruent to FE. To help you check your answer, what you can do is take the original figures and redraw them so that they're in the exact same position, and it'll help you compare the side lengths and the angles if you need to. Okay, for this question, this time we're going to be given two triangles that we are told to be congruent. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. We know that angle B is 30 degrees, angle C is 75, and then we know that angle E is also 30 degrees. So how can you, and that's supposed to be a 30, I don't know, sorry about that. How can you find what the measure of angle D is? Well, the thing here is that we have to remember that we know these two triangles are congruent, which means that corresponding angles are going to have the same exact measure. We know based on what's listed up here, A and D go together, B and E go together, and C and F go together. So if we can figure out what angle A is, then we can figure out what angle D is. We're going to have to use the triangle angle sum theorem here, and the triangle angle sum theorem says that all three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So we know that angle A plus 30 plus 75 is equal to 180. Solve for angle A, and you would end up getting that angle A is going to be 75 degrees. And so, since angle A is congruent to angle D, that means that they both equal 75. So our correct answer is that angle D is equal to 75 degrees. Alright, so here's a question where you're going to have to figure out if these two triangles are congruent. And what you're going to need to do is actually look at the information that you're given, look at what's marked, and see if you have enough information whether or not the two triangles are congruent. So in this case, one of the questions is how do you determine whether these two triangles are congruent? And the first thing to do is to look and say, okay, are all the pairs of corresponding parts congruent? Are all the three angles and are all the three sides congruent to each other that are supposed to be? Another question to ask yourself is how many conditions must be met to show that two triangles are congruent? Well, and the definition said that the figures must have congruent sides and congruent angles. So there must be three pairs of angles and three pairs of sides that are congruent to each other. On this picture, we have one unmarked angle, though. So do we know anything about that angle? If you look, angle C is not marked, but do we know anything about angle C for both of those triangles? And the answer is actually yes, we do. They're both vertical angles, so that's going to help us. Vertical angles are congruent. And then we need to remember what those little tick marks and those little arcs mean. Remember that the tick marks show that the side lengths are congruent, and the little arcs and the angles mean that the angles are congruent. So if you have one arc, then it's only congruent to other angles with one arc. If we have two arcs, then they're congruent to two angles that have two marks. So first thing we know that AB is congruent to ED based on it being given, basically. We know that because it's marked. We know that BC is congruent to DC because we know that BC is 4 and so was DC. That helped us. That gave us enough information to tell us that those were congruent. If they're equal, then they are congruent. Remember that. We know that AC is congruent to EC because we know that AC was equal to 6 and so was EC. We know that angle A is congruent to angle E, and we also know that angle B angle B is congruent to angle D. That's given to us. It's marked. And then we know that angle BCA is congruent to angle DCE because vertical angles are congruent. So based on all of that, we can conclude that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC by the definition of congruent triangles. Notice that I abbreviated on here, and that's okay that you do that too. And I'm sorry, my handwriting is kind of a little sloppy. These pens are hard to use on these iPad screens. But this is basically, I just basically did a proof. If you really look at the format of this, it's basically a 2-column proof, and we are going to be doing those again. This next chapter, you're going to be having to solve for proofs, 2 columns, what we're probably going to use the most of the time. But you're going to have to use the theorems that we're going to be given. So make sure you know that. Last thing is to actually do a proof for proving that 2 triangles are congruent, an actual proof. This one, I didn't say to prove it, I just said, are they congruent and justify? So we'll do a proof in the beginning of class tomorrow. Make sure that you come prepared with these notes so you can answer the video question that I'm going to have in the beginning of class. That's going to count as a daily grade, so make sure that you take good notes and bring those so that way you can answer the question. You have a good night, and I will see you guys tomorrow.